The Amtrak Carolinian hummed east out of Charlotte as morning light slid across the Piedmont, a silver ribbon of track unspooling toward Raleigh. In coach car C, Evelyn Eve Whitaker sat by the window with a small carry-on tucked at her feet, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had already cooled. Across the aisle, the world flickered by pines, billboards, a water tower painted like a checkerboard, while inside the car the air held that muted hush of strangers sharing space. The soft thrum of the engine, the rustle of a newspaper, the faint whistle between cars whenever the doors sighed open. "Tickets, please," the attendant said, working his way down the aisle with a handheld scanner. Eve lifted her phone, the screen blooming with the QR code. A quick chirp, a nod, and he moved on. She exhaled without realizing she'd been holding her breath. The seat beside her remained empty until Greensboro, when 3 women boarded together from the same doorway and filtered down the aisle like a small current. One, sleek bob, dark blazer, carried a tablet and the clipped calm of someone traveling for work. Another, warm face, hair in a low bun, slipped a worn paperback into her tote and smiled at anyone who met her eyes. The youngest, Freckles, a coral hoodie, hair tipped blush pink, wrestled a backpack the size of a weekend cabin onto the rack and then dropped into the seat across from Eve with a soft, triumphant huff. "Mind if I sit here?" the pink-tipped one asked, though she was already halfway settled. "Of course," Eve said. The tablet woman took the aisle seat across from them. The reader slid into the row behind. The train lurched, gathered itself, and the station slid away. For a while there was only the steady cadence of rails underfoot and the thin, almost polite glow of the cars overheads. Eve's reflection hovered in the window, high cheekbones, a faint line at her mouth that hadn't been there a few years ago, and behind it a smear of loblolly pines. "You headed to Raleigh too?" the younger one asked, unzipping her hoodie. "I'm doing a campus visit. Chapel Hill tomorrow. My aunt says I should get off in Durham and Uber." "Raleigh," Eve said. "Visiting family." "Oh!" The reader leaned forward over Eve's shoulder, a soft southern lilt slipping into the aisle. "I'm on my way to a continuing ed seminar. I'm Ruth, licensed therapist, sometimes professional listener," she added with a small smile, as if offering an easy place to set a heavy bag. "You two can ignore me if I take notes." The tablet woman chuckled, not looking up. "Allie," she said. "Tech conference. More coffee than code, if I'm honest." The young one grinned. "J. Potential Tar Heel. Current disaster at parallel parking." Names hung in the air, light and unsticky. They were the sort of introductions people made when the journey was short and the stories were long. Eve nodded to each, sipping the last of her coffee. It had cooled to something metallic and faintly sweet, the way train coffee does when it forgets itself. Outside, frost still clung to the shaded hollows. A creek flashed briefly between trees, bright as foil. Eve watched it pass and felt the familiar prickle at the base of her neck, the one that had arrived with morning and refused to leave. Anxiety made simple things strange. Seat fabric too scratchy, air too dry, heart too busy. She pressed her thumb into the rim of the cup and focused on the circle of pressure, the way nurses had once told her to anchor herself when the room felt like it was sliding. "All right back there?" Ruth asked, gentle, not prying. Eve nodded. "Just didn't sleep much." Jay leaned over the armrest, conspiratorial. "You ever notice how trains make people thinky? Like you're moving forward, but also stuck, so your brain goes, 'Now is the time to remember everything you ever did wrong.'" Allie glanced up from her tablet. "That's oddly specific." Jay shrugged. "My mom says I narrate my own life, like a podcast no one subscribed to." The car swayed as they crossed a trestle. Below, a river shouldered past sycamores, pale and leafless. The angled winter light made the world look freshly photographed. Edges crisper, shadows more honest. Eve let her gaze settle there because it was easier than meeting Ruth's curious kindness or Jay's bright interest. The past had a way of walking in when the doors between cars opened. She had survived a year of mornings like this. Clean air, ordinary light, and still the memory would not soften. It arrived whole, with the smell of old wood, the tick of a baseboard heater, the precise panic that splits a second in two. "It's fine," Eve heard herself say, as much to the others as to the reel that had begun to spin behind her eyes. "I was just thinking about last winter." Allie slid the tablet into her bag. Ruth, true to her word, didn't push. Jay propped her chin on her fist and waited, the respectful stillness of someone who had grown up with elders who told stories like they were maps. "You don't have to," Ruth said, "but you can." The train took a curve. A steady, iron heartbeat pulsed through the car. Eve looked down at her hands. No ring now, only the pale circle where one had lived, and then back at the window where the reflection of her face overlapped with a bank of pines. "It was a farmhouse," she said at last, "out past Albemarle, near the line where the fields start pretending they're hills. It used to be my grandmother's. We'd been fixing it up slow." She could see it when she closed her eyes. The narrow porch sagging at the steps, the storm door that caught in summer, the well-lit her husband had planned to replace in spring. They had left town late after a dinner where people congratulated him and clapped his back and said he was the sort who did the right thing without asking who was watching. The road home had been dark and 2 lanes and familiar. "I woke up around 2, Eve said. "I remember the heater and the smell of cedar from the closet. And then the word caught." She let the train carry her a few breaths. "I saw him, Samuel, standing by the foot of the bed. Not as he was the day she shook her head once. Younger, like when we first met. He looked at me and said, 'Get up and go outside. Now.'" Jay's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. Ruth's hand stayed, folded on her tote, thumbs touching. Allie didn't glance around to see who might be listening. "I didn't question it," Eve said. "I slid my feet into my boots, grabbed my jacket, and walked out onto the porch. I didn't even take my phone." She could still feel the night air, thin and sharp enough to sting the throat. "I got to the bottom step and the kitchen window blew out. It wasn't a roar, not at first. More like the house inhaled and then let go." The sentence hung there, the end of it occupied by sound. Glass, the hump of oxygen finding fire, the sudden chant of crickets falling silent as if night itself held its breath. Eve traced the seam of the paper cup. They said later it was a gas leak. Old line in the crawl space. The kind of thing you only find when it's too late. Silence settled for a beat, not heavy, just attentive. A mile marker slid past, white on green, the numbers precise and unhelpful. Eve felt the small give of the train as it crossed a road and the echo of that other vibration, the one that had rippled through the boards beneath her boots a split second before the house lit the yard like day. "I know how it sounds," she said, "and I don't expect anyone to believe me. But if he hadn't told me to get up, you're here," Ruth said softly. Not a conclusion, a blessing. Eve nodded. The coffee trembled faintly in her hand. She set it in the cup holder and laced her fingers together in her lap. Outside, pasture opened like a page, rolled fence lines, and a lone cow staring with the odd serenity of animals who know more than they say. Jay blew out a breath. "Okay, that's wow." Allie tilted her head. "And you said last winter." Meaning, that wasn't the first time. The car's door at the far end opened. A wash of colder air carried the distant chatter of the cafe car. Eve glanced toward the sound, then back at the 3 faces turned to her. A student who still believed the world would reveal itself if she stared hard enough. A professional listener who knew that it often did. A woman who had already coated herself a sturdy raft and was willing to share the oars. That wasn't the first time, Eve said. Her voice had steadied. The words found their place, like luggage finally settling into the rack above. To understand, I need to start from the beginning. The story Evelyn carried with her began in the raw years of the early 1990s, when the South was still struggling to recover from the shuttering of industries that had once been its backbone. Charlotte had thrived on textiles and mills, entire neighborhoods built around the hum of looms and the whistle of factory sirens. But when the largest plant closed its doors, jobs vanished overnight. Her father, once a steady man with a clockwork routine, found himself driving a yellow cab through neighborhoods that no longer recognized him. Evelyn remembered the night as if it had been pressed into her skin. She was 11, sitting at the kitchen table of their modest ranch home on the edge of town. The refrigerator hummed louder than usual, her mother's silence louder still. It was a neighbor who came to the door, hat in his hands, eyes downcast. Her father had picked up the wrong fare, late shift near Tryon Street. The man pulled a gun for a few bills and left him slumped in the back seat of his own cab. Just like that, the one constant in Evelyn's life disappeared into police reports and a funeral service at the small Baptist church they had always attended. Her mother, Marjorie Whitaker, was forced into double shifts at a local hospital, a nurse's aide job, backbreaking, underpaid, but it kept food on the table. The old ranch house was sold. Mother and daughter packed their lives into cardboard boxes and moved into a cramped apartment complex off Albemarle Road. The walls were thin, the carpet stained, and their upstairs neighbors argued loud enough to make dishes tremble in the cabinets. Evelyn often lay awake listening to her mother's muffled sobs through the wall, tears shed only when she thought her daughter was asleep. By the time Evelyn started middle school, grief had calcified into a kind of armor. She carried her books pressed tight against her chest, kept her head down in the hallways. But grief was no shield against cruelty. At lunch in the school cafeteria, where plastic trays clattered and the smell of reheated pizza filled the air, she became an easy target. Savannah Brooks, golden hair, designer backpack, the daughter of a powerful developer who seemed to own half the city, chose Evelyn like a cat chooses a mouse. It began with whispers. "That's the poor girl, the one whose daddy got himself shot." Then came the laughter when Evelyn wore secondhand jeans, the shove of a shoulder as she passed through the crowded hallway. Savannah's clique, a polished ring of girls who always smelled of expensive perfume and carried the confidence of families who lunched at country clubs, made a game out of breaking her spirit. In the cafeteria, they would slide onto the bench beside her uninvited, taking food from her tray and making exaggerated faces. She eats the free lunch." Their voices dripped with mockery, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Sometimes they would tip her carton of milk across the table, watching it spread like a small flood while Evelyn scrambled to save her notebooks. Teachers looked the other way, too busy or unwilling to cross Savannah's father, who donated generously to school fundraisers. The locker room was worse. Metal doors clanged shut, sneakers squeaked against tile, and there was nowhere to hide. Savannah once yanked Evelyn's gym clothes from the bench and tossed them into the showers, letting the water drench them before Evelyn could reach them. Another time she cornered her near the mirrors, sneering about the way her hair never shone like theirs. "Some of us don't have to shop at Goodwill, Whitaker," she said, laughter echoing off the walls. Evelyn stood rigid, cheeks hot, hands trembling as she pulled her damp clothes from the floor. It was humiliation stacked like bricks, day after day, until even walking into school felt like stepping onto a stage where the script had already been written against her. She tried telling her mother once, but Marjorie, exhausted from back-to-back shifts, could only offer a weary hug. "Keep your head high, baby. They'll get theirs one day," she murmured, though her own voice sounded uncertain. For Evelyn, those years blurred into a gray stretch of survival. She studied hard, spent hours in the library where the silence could not jeer at her, and dreamed of kitchens where she could transform simple ingredients into something beautiful. Still, every insult, every shove in the hallway, carved itself into memory. She carried the sting of Savannah Brooks's, laughter the way some carried scars, invisible but no less real. Looking back, Evelyn understood that those years had been her first training ground. Life stripped her of illusions early. Fathers could be taken in an instant, safety could vanish with the closing of a factory door, and cruelty often wore the face of privilege. Yet somewhere inside that fragile girl who kept her head bowed in the cafeteria was a resilience waiting to rise. She didn't know it yet, but those humiliations would one day forge the steel she would need to survive the greater fires still to come. The breaking point came one Thursday afternoon in early spring, when the air in the cafeteria hung thick with the smell of fries and disinfectant. Evelyn carried her tray carefully, balancing a carton of milk and the only hot entree she could afford, chicken nuggets, lukewarm and rubbery. She had almost made it to the far end of the room where she liked to sit alone when Savannah Brooks slid a manicured hand across her path, sending the tray clattering to the floor. Nuggets scattered like dice, milk pooling across the linoleum. "Oops," Savannah cooed, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Guess Whitaker wanted the janitor's special. Laughter erupted from her circle of friends. One mimed gagging. Another pointed at Evelyn's flushed face. The cafeteria seemed to pause, every noise sharper, the humiliation sinking deeper. Evelyn crouched to pick up the nuggets, throat burning with the familiar mix of anger and shame. That was when a shadow cut across the fluorescent light. A boy stepped between her and Savannah, tall enough to block the sneers, broad enough to quiet the laughter. Samuel Porter, Sam as everyone called him, was a junior, the son of a decorated officer at Fort Bragg. His presence carried something different, a quiet authority honed by discipline most high schoolers didn't know. He bent down, helped Evelyn gather her tray, and then stood squarely in front of Savannah. "Pick on someone else," he said, voice calm but edged with steel. His gaze didn't waver, and for the first time, Savannah looked uncertain. Everyone knew Sam trained in martial arts. Rumors floated that he'd taken regional titles, that his father insisted on drills before dawn. He wasn't the kind of boy you tested lightly. Savannah tried to laugh it off. "Just a joke." "Didn't look funny," Sam replied. The cafeteria hushed, eyes darting between them. Savannah, unused to being challenged, tossed her hair and muttered something under her breath, retreating to her table. Her friends followed, their laughter hollow now. Evelyn stood frozen, tray in hand. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," Sam interrupted gently. "Nobody deserves that." From that day forward, her orbit shifted. At first it was small gestures. Walking beside her in the hall, sliding into the seat across from her in the library, asking if she'd finished the Ray Bradbury novel assigned in English class. Evelyn, used to silence, found herself answering. Soon their conversations stretched, moving from classwork to dreams. Sam confessed he wanted to serve like his father, but also hoped to study engineering after. Evelyn admitted she dreamed of kitchens, of crafting dishes that felt like stories. They traded books, Arthur C. Clarke from his shelf, a tattered Betty Crocker cookbook from hers. On weekends, they sat under the bleachers, she sketching recipes in a spiral notebook, he sketching designs for machines he hoped to build. He taught her the basics of balance and defense, showing her how to plant her feet so no one could shove her down again. She taught him the comfort of turning flour and sugar into something warm enough to soften any day. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something rarer for Evelyn, a friendship untainted by pity or cruelty, a space where she wasn't defined by loss or poverty. Home life still bore its weight. Marjorie Whitaker worked nights, her exhaustion etched deeper each week. Their apartment walls pressed close, the television upstairs a constant thrum. But soon another place opened to Evelyn, the Porter household. Sam's father was often deployed, his voice a distant echo over crackling phone lines. But Ruth Porter, his mother, welcomed Evelyn as though she had always belonged. Ruth was sturdy, with kind eyes and the unhurried patience of someone who knew the cost of military life. She pressed extra servings onto Evelyn's plate at dinner, asked about school as though every detail mattered. When Evelyn first stepped into their home, a brick house near the edge of town with a flag planted firmly by the porch, she was struck by its warmth. Photographs lined the walls. Sam in a karate GI, his father in uniform. Ruth laughing in a garden. Ruth noticed the threadbare jacket Evelyn wore and quietly placed a folded sweater on the back of her chair. She offered rides, advice, and something Evelyn had almost forgotten how to receive: simple kindness with no strings attached. The porter's kitchen became a refuge. Evelyn stood beside Ruth, learning how to roll biscuits properly, flour on her hands and laughter in the air. Sam teased her mercilessly when she burned the first batch, but his grin softened the sting. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, not just for food, but for the feeling of being wanted. School still carried its cruelties. Savannah never forgave being shown up and continued her jabs from afar, but the sting dulled. Walking the halls with Sam at her side, Evelyn felt the bullies hesitate. His presence was a shield, but more than that, his friendship became proof that she wasn't invisible. Late at night, lying in her narrow bed, Evelyn replayed the moments. Sam's steady eyes, Ruth's gentle hand on her shoulder, the way laughter filled rooms that used to feel cold. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world had space for her too. And so a bond began, born not out of romance, but out of rescue, kindness, and the fragile hope that two broken paths could one day weave into something stronger. What Evelyn didn't yet know was how deeply that bond would shape her future, how it would anchor her through storms she couldn't yet imagine. But sitting in the porter's warm kitchen, with biscuits cooling on the counter and Ruth humming softly to herself, she felt, for the first time in years, that she had found a place where she truly belonged. After graduation, life tugged them onto different tracks with a force neither of them could resist. For Sam Porter, the path had always seemed charted. Enlistment papers signed the spring of senior year, a bus ride to Fort Benning, and a future shaped by the same discipline that had defined his father's life at Fort Bragg. For Evelyn, escape meant ambition, the acceptance letter from a small but respected culinary school in Charlotte. She clutched it like a passport to somewhere better, somewhere her father's ghost and Savannah Brooks's laughter couldn't reach. They promised to keep in touch. Sam's handshake lingered into something almost like an embrace, his eyes shadowed by the weight of goodbye. Letters came at first, his handwriting square and neat, folded crisply in military-issue envelopes. Evelyn devoured them, the smell of paper and ink like a lifeline. But as weeks turned to months, the sentences grew shorter, stripped of warmth, updates about training, the weather, an injury in his unit. Never once did he mention missing her, never once the quiet moments they had shared. Then Evelyn heard whispers that stung, sharper than silence. Caroline Montgomery, the banker's daughter who floated through Charlotte High in a cloud of privilege and perfume, was receiving letters too. Only hers brimmed with affection. Rumors spread that Caroline read them aloud to friends. Long passages where Sam described sunsets on base, how he dreamed of her smile. Evelyn, who had never received a word beyond "stay safe" and "work hard," folded her last letter and tucked it into a shoebox she could not bear to open again. Pain became fuel. At culinary school, she poured herself into every class, every knife skill, every sauce reduction. She scrubbed stock pots until her knuckles cracked, memorized the chemistry of sugar, and learned to plate dishes with the precision of an artist. Instructors took notice. "Whitaker," Chef DuPont barked one day, tapping her shoulder with a wooden spoon. "You've got the instincts. The rest is discipline. Keep this pace and you'll run kitchens, not just cook in them." Her classmates went out on weekends, chasing the brief thrill of youth. Evelyn stayed behind in the practice kitchen, burning batch after batch of soufflés until one finally rose just right. Sleep became a rumor, ambition her constant companion. Yet, even when accolades followed, top marks in class, a coveted internship at a fine dining restaurant uptown, the hollow inside her deepened. She could silence Savannah's laughter and prove her worth to the world, but she could not silence the memory of Sam's steady gaze or the ache of his absence. Charlotte's restaurant scene became her battleground. The fine dining kitchen where she earned her stripes was brutal, Heat blasting from grills, chefs shouting orders like drill sergeants, the clatter of pans like gunfire. She thrived in it. "Table 4, Whitaker, your scallops better sing," the head chef barked, and they did. Perfect sear, butter basting until golden. By 21, she was earning the respect of men twice her age, her reputation building one plate at a time. Yet when she walked home past the glittering bank towers that Caroline's father had financed, bitterness curled in her chest. The blow landed on a humid evening in June. Evelyn had just finished a double shift when she stopped at a newsstand for a bottle of water. The headline blared from the society page of the Charlotte Observer: "Montgomery heiress engaged to decorated soldier." The photo showed Caroline in a white sundress, hand lifted to display a diamond ring. Sam at her side in uniform. He looked older, more defined, but unmistakably him. His arm around Caroline's waist, his smile wide, his eyes fixed on her as though no one else existed. Evelyn's water slipped from her grasp, splashing across the sidewalk. Strangers brushed past, unconcerned, while she stared at the page until the words blurred. It felt as though the cafeteria floor had been pulled from under her again. Only this time there was no tray to gather, no Sam to stand between her and humiliation. There was only the truth that while she had been clawing her way forward, burying grief and humiliation under hours at the stove, Sam had chosen a future with someone else. That night, she returned to her apartment, changed from her whites into silence, and sat at her tiny kitchen table until dawn. The shoebox of letters sat at her feet. She did not open it. Instead, she sharpened her knives, set her textbooks in order, and promised herself one thing. If she could not have love, she would have excellence. If her heart must remain empty, at least her life would not. From that moment on, Evelyn buried herself deeper in work, chasing perfection in every sauce, every cut, every service. The kitchen became her world, and ambition her armor. She told herself she didn't need Sam Porter. But in the quiet hours when the burners had cooled and the night pressed in, she knew the wound would never quite close. The kitchen became Evelyn Whitaker's proving ground, a crucible where she traded hours of sleep for hours of skill. She began at the very bottom, scrubbing sheet pans until her fingers blistered, hauling crates of produce through the back door of Charlotte's most demanding French restaurant. She was the kitchen hand no one noticed, except when she moved too slowly. But Evelyn absorbed everything. The cadence of orders shouted in staccato, the rhythm of pans hitting burners, the language of fire and steel. Months of grit earned her a station on garde-manger, arranging salads with trembling hands. From there, she clawed her way to the hot line, searing duck breasts, learning to read the color of butter as it foamed. By her mid-20s, she was sous chef, the youngest in the restaurant's history. The head chef trusted her to manage the line on busy Friday nights. "Whitaker," he'd bark, "make sure this kitchen doesn't burn." And she didn't. Service after service, she stood unshaken, her ambition the one thing she could control. Outside the kitchen, the world moved on without her. Evelyn read in the paper that Sam Porter had married Caroline Montgomery in a lavish ceremony at the Montgomery estate, the kind of Southern wedding that drew headlines. She didn't attend, of course. She wouldn't have been invited. But the photo spread was impossible to miss. Caroline in a lace gown, Sam in his dress uniform, medals catching the light. They looked like a couple from a magazine cover, the embodiment of privilege and sacrifice. Evelyn folded the page neatly and slid it into the trash, though her chest ached for days. Love had been replaced by ambition. She worked 12, 14 hours at a stretch, stumbling home to her apartment with the smell of garlic and smoke in her hair. She had no time for romance, no room for longing. At least, that was what she told herself. Yet in the quiet moments, when the last pan had been scrubbed, when the walk-in hummed behind her, Sam's face still lingered. She remembered the way he had stood in the cafeteria years ago, his steady voice cutting through Savannah Brooks's laughter. That memory burned brighter than any flame she worked with in the kitchen. It might have continued that way forever, Evelyn climbing, Sam locked away in a world she could not touch, if not for the accident. It was a stormy night, rain slicking the Carolina highways, when Sam's car spun out on an oil patch and slammed into a guardrail. The newspapers reported he survived only because of the quick response of a passing trucker who dragged him from the wreck. But survival came at a cost. Spinal damage that left him confined to a wheelchair. His promising military career ended in a single night of twisted steel and rain. Caroline Montgomery, who had once preened in front of cameras with Sam at her side, lasted exactly 2 weeks. 14 days of visiting the hospital, her smile growing thinner with each appointment, until one morning she simply stopped showing up. By the end of the month, she had filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The Montgomery family moved on, their daughter's reputation tidied by money and distance. Sam remained in a rehab facility, bitter and broken, his world reduced to 4 sterile walls and the endless beeping of machines. Evelyn learned the news from the Charlotte Observer, a short column buried deep inside. She clipped it out without thinking, her hand shaking. Memories she had tried to bury rushed back with a violence that stole her breath. For days, she walked through her shifts like a ghost, plates leaving the pass window without her even seeing them. The fire that had fueled her career dimmed under the weight of what she knew. One evening after closing, she found Ruth Porter waiting for her outside the restaurant. The older woman stood beneath the awning, rain dripping from her umbrella, eyes etched with desperation. Evelyn's breath caught. Ruth had aged, but her presence carried the same warmth Evelyn remembered from high school dinners at the Porter table. "Evelyn," Ruth said softly, clutching her arm. "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't life or death." Evelyn led her inside, into the empty dining room where the last chairs were stacked. Ruth's voice trembled as she explained Sam's accident, the paralysis, Caroline's abandonment, how he refused visitors, refused therapy, refused hope. "He's shutting down," Ruth whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He needs someone who won't let him, someone who can reach him." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Ruth, I don't know if I'm the right person. Not after everything." Ruth squeezed her hand, eyes fierce with a mother's plea. "Please, he needs someone. He needs you." The words landed with the force of destiny, undoing every wall Evelyn had built. She stood in the dim restaurant, the smell of lemon polish and extinguished burners still lingering, and realized the truth. No matter how far she had run, no matter how high she had climbed, her heart had never stopped orbiting Sam Porter. Now he was broken, abandoned, and calling for help without saying a word. And Evelyn knew, in that moment, that she could not turn away. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables, the universal scent of institutions where days bled into one another. Evelyn paused outside the rehab wing, her palms damp against the strap of her purse. For days, she had debated this moment, telling herself she would walk away, that Sam Porter's life was no longer hers to touch. But Ruth's words had anchored themselves in her chest. "Please, he needs you." She found him in a corner room with the blinds half drawn, the television muted. Sam sat in a wheelchair, shoulders slumped, a book unopened on his lap. The man who had once carried himself like steel now seemed diminished, folded into himself. His jaw was unshaven, eyes hollow. He didn't look up until Ruth nudged the door wider. "Samuel," Ruth said gently, "you have a visitor." His gaze flicked up and hardened when it landed on Evelyn. For a moment, silence stretched, sharp as glass. Then he muttered, "Why did you come?" The words were brittle, laced with anger, too tired to burn, but still sharp enough to wound. Evelyn's throat tightened, but she forced herself to step closer. "Because," she said quietly, "I couldn't let you suffer alone." The book slid from his lap to the floor with a dull thud. His shoulders rose, then fell, as if all the fight had drained from him at once. He turned his face toward the window, unwilling to let her see the tears gathering in his eyes. The days that followed were difficult. Sam bristled at her presence, snapping when she tried to help him with simple tasks. "I don't need pity," he growled when she adjusted the blanket across his legs. Evelyn didn't answer. She simply picked the book up from the floor, set it back on his tray, and returned the next morning. She was there through the small humiliations of rehab, the way his hands fumbled with utensils, the frustration when his body refused to obey commands that once came easily. He cursed, slammed his fists against the armrests, told her to leave. Still, Evelyn stayed. She learned the routines, how to adjust his chair, how to encourage without smothering, how to sit in silence when silence was all he could bear. Her career slowed, opportunities slipping away while she spent her nights at his bedside and her mornings coaxing him through therapy sessions. Colleagues whispered that she was wasting her talent, but when she looked at Sam, broken and bitter, she knew the truth. The kitchen would always be there. Sam might not. Weeks stretched into months. Underneath the anger, something shifted. He began to accept her presence, if not welcome it. She caught him watching her once, his expression softer than he intended. He started answering her questions in more than monosyllables, telling her about the books he had read, the nights he dreamed of running. When the therapist pushed him onto the parallel bars, Evelyn stood beside him, whispering encouragement, her hand ready to steady his trembling arm. The first attempts ended in collapse. His legs buckled, his arms shook, his voice cracked with fury. But Evelyn refused to let him drown in despair. "One step at a time," she murmured. "You don't have to run. Just stand." And then, one morning, it happened. He gripped the bars, muscles taut, sweat beading across his brow. Evelyn's heart hammered as she counted the breaths with him. Inch by inch, Sam straightened. His legs trembled, his jaw clenched, but he rose, fully upright for the first time since the accident. The room fell silent. The therapist's clipboard lowered. Ruth pressed a hand over her mouth, and Evelyn's eyes blurred with tears. Sam stood swaying between the bars, his face contorted, not just with pain, but with something fiercer, defiance. "I'm up," he whispered hoarsely, almost in disbelief. Evelyn stepped closer, her voice breaking. "Yes, you are." He took a step, awkward, halting, but a step nonetheless. The catharsis washed through the room, raw and undeniable. Evelyn reached out, steadying him as he stumbled. He leaned against her shoulder, his breath ragged, but there was a fire in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. In that moment, all the bitterness, all the nights of anger and silence, melted into something new. Not quite hope, not yet joy, but the first fragile spark of healing. And Evelyn knew, as she held him upright beneath the sterile lights of that hospital room, that this was the beginning of their return. Not to what they once were, but to something stronger, forged in pain and resilience. Their wedding was nothing like the lavish Montgomery affair that had once graced the society pages. There were no crystal chandeliers or orchestra quartets, no headlines to capture the moment. Instead, Samuel Porter and Evelyn Whitaker exchanged vows beneath the vaulted ceiling of a small church on the edge of Charlotte. The pews held only a handful of people, Ruth seated in the front row, Evelyn's mother weeping softly beside her, and a few close friends who had witnessed their long and winding road. Sam wheeled himself to the altar, refusing assistance, and when he slipped the ring onto Evelyn's hand, his voice was steady, determined. Their kiss was quiet, but it carried the weight of years lost and years yet to come. Marriage brought no fairy tale transformation, only the steady rhythm of two people building a life from fractured beginnings. They rented a modest townhouse not far from downtown. At night, Evelyn lay awake sometimes, listening to the hum of traffic and the even cadence of Sam's breathing beside her, marveling that after all the storms, they had found their way back to one another. Doctors had warned them early. Sam's injuries might prevent him from ever fathering children. The words had hung heavy over them, another loss piled onto the wreckage. But life, it seemed, had its own plan. A year into their marriage, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. Shock gave way to joy, and 9 months later Lydia Porter entered the world, red-faced and furious, her cries filling the delivery room like a declaration of victory. Sam held her with trembling hands, tears slipping down his cheeks. "She's a miracle," he whispered, and Evelyn believed him. Lydia transformed their home. Her giggles echoed through the halls. Her tiny footprints left traces of wonder across their days. For Sam, she was living proof that broken bodies did not mean broken futures. For Evelyn, she was the embodiment of hope after decades of loss. Together, they marveled at each milestone. First steps, first words, as though each one rewrote the story of what was possible. With Ruth's help, Sam slowly shifted from patient to provider. Though he would never return to military service, his sharp mind and keen eye found new purpose. He opened a private detective agency, operating from a small office above a law firm. At first, the cases were simple, missing spouses, background checks, but his reputation grew quickly. Former comrades from Fort Bragg referred clients. Lawyers began to trust his thorough reports, and soon his work provided steady income. The pride in his eyes when he handed Evelyn his first paycheck was brighter than any medal. Evelyn, too, carved out her place. She left the brutal fine dining kitchens behind and opened a culinary workshop downtown, teaching classes to young chefs and home cooks alike. What began as a few rented hours in a community kitchen blossomed into a full-fledged school with her name on the window, Whitaker Culinary Studio. She taught everything from knife skills to pastries, filling the space with the aromas of butter, garlic, and ambition. Parents brought children to learn. Couples signed up for date nights, and the local paper ran a feature on her journey from line cook to entrepreneur. Finances steadied. They bought a small brick house with a yard just big enough for Lydia to chase fireflies in summer. Weekends were filled with family breakfasts. Sam's agency paperwork spread across the dining table while Evelyn tested new recipes. They argued sometimes about bills, about Lydia staying up too late, about who forgot to take out the trash. But even their arguments carried the ease of two people who knew the other was not going anywhere. For the first time in years, peace took root. Evenings ended with Sam reading Lydia to sleep, his voice low and sure, while Evelyn tidied the kitchen, smiling to herself at the sound of them together. Sundays meant dinner at Ruth's house, the smell of cornbread drifting from the oven, laughter filling the rooms where once grief had lingered. The shadows of the past never disappeared completely. There were nights Evelyn woke gasping from dreams of fire, days Sam's legs ached with memories of the crash. But those moments no longer defined them. They had built a fortress from love and persistence, from biscuits shared in Ruth's kitchen to vows spoken in the quiet of a church. By their 10th anniversary, Evelyn often caught herself marveling at the ordinary beauty of it all. The clatter of pots in her workshop, the ring of Sam's office phone, Lydia's laughter in the yard. Life had not given them the fairy tale, but it had given them something rarer, a second chance, built brick by brick, tender and fierce. And as the sun set over their little brick house, painting the sky in southern hues of rose and gold, Evelyn felt, perhaps for the first time, that the world had finally given her permission to hope. The year 2020 arrived heavy with unease. Charlotte, like the rest of the country, was bracing for storms both visible and hidden. For Samuel Porter, the cases landing on his desk grew darker. What had begun years earlier as simple investigations had evolved into something more dangerous. Tracking rings that preyed on the most vulnerable. That spring, Sam uncovered a trafficking operation hidden behind the facade of a logistics company. The details were sickening, children shuttled like cargo, their voices silenced by threats and money. He worked with local police, sharing his evidence, pushing them to act when others hesitated. The raid that followed freed 6 children, their faces etched into Sam's memory like scars he carried proudly. The mayor praised the police, the papers published a small story, but Sam needed no recognition. "If I can put even one of them back into their mother's arms," he told Evelyn, "that's more than enough." She had seen the cost of such work, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he rubbed at his temples late into the night. Still, she never told him to stop. She knew he couldn't. That summer, Ruth insisted they attend a dinner in his honor. Quiet, just family and close friends, nothing grand. Evelyn remembered the warmth of that evening. Lydia sitting between her grandparents. Sam smiling more easily than he had in months. They left the restaurant just as night deepened over the city, rain streaking the streets. Evelyn teased him about his tie, crooked as always, and he leaned over in the car to kiss her cheek. The world still felt safe in that moment, but safety is fragile. On the drive home, a semi barreled through a red light on Independence Boulevard. Sam saw it first, headlights cutting across the darkness. Instinct, honed through years of discipline, took over. He jerked the wheel hard, pushing Evelyn's side of the car away from the direct impact. Metal screamed, glass shattered, and the world went white. When the chaos cleared, Sam was gone. The paramedics found Evelyn unconscious, her body broken but alive, her breath shallow against the rasp of machines. Sam's hand, they said, was still on the wheel, his body shielding hers from the worst of the crash. He had saved her life with the last seconds of his own. Evelyn drifted in a coma, trapped between worlds. Tubes anchored her to the bed, machines breathed for her. Ruth kept vigil, Lydia curled against her side, too young to understand why her father's chair sat empty in the corner. Doctors whispered probabilities, measuring life in percentages. In the stillness of her coma, Evelyn dreamed. She saw Sam, whole and strong, standing at the edge of a field they had once driven past on summer evenings. His uniform was gone. He wore the faded shirt she remembered from their earliest days. "Eve," he said softly, his voice as steady as ever, "you have to keep going. For her. For Lydia. She needs you." She reached for him, tears burning her dream skin. "I can't do this without you." "You can," he replied. His hand brushed her cheek, warm, real, even as he stepped back. "Promise me." When she woke weeks later, blinking against the fluorescent lights, Ruth was the first face she saw. Relief broke across her features as she called for the nurse. But when Evelyn's hoarse whisper asked for Sam, the silence that followed told her everything. She turned her face toward the wall and wept until the monitors beeped in alarm. As if fate hadn't punished her enough, tragedy struck again. In the autumn of that same year, an oxygen system in the hospital malfunctioned, igniting a fire that ripped through the lower floor. Alarms shrieked, smoke poured through vents. Nurses rushed room to room, pulling patients from beds. Evelyn, still weak from her injuries, was wheeled out with flames licking at the walls. Outside, under the red wash of emergency lights, she coughed smoke from her lungs and realized how close she had come to joining Sam after all. Twice, death had reached for her. Twice something or someone had pulled her back. But survival did not feel like victory. The weeks that followed were a blur of condolences, memorial services, and paperwork that reduced Sam's life to signatures and stamps. Evelyn moved through it like a ghost, her body healing, but her heart hollow. She returned to their house and found his jacket draped over the chair, his files stacked neatly on the desk, his voice still echoing faintly in the rooms where he had laughed with Lydia. Depression settled over her, like a storm cloud that refused to lift. She rose each morning because Lydia needed breakfast, because bills needed paying, because Ruth begged her not to give up. But once the house was quiet, she sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the stove, remembering the nights she had cooked for him, the mornings they had shared coffee. The silence was unbearable. At night, she dreamed of fire, the crash, the hospital blaze, the farmhouse she had once fled. Always, Sam appeared at the edge of the flames, urging her forward, reminding her she still had a reason to live. But each morning she woke to absence, the bed cold beside her, the ache deeper than any wound. By winter, Evelyn no longer pretended to be whole. She carried her grief openly, as heavy as the scar down her side. The world saw resilience. She felt only emptiness. Sam had given his life to save hers, and now she faced the cruelest truth of all. She must find a way to keep living in a world where he no longer existed. When winter finally broke into a pale, reluctant spring, Evelyn Whittaker made a decision she hadn't dared imagine during the long, dark months after Sam's death. The townhouse in Charlotte, with its hum of traffic and reminders of a life built together, had become unbearable. Every room echoed with absence. The jacket still draped over his chair, Lydia's drawings taped to walls he would never see. She could not keep pretending that the house was home. And so, with Ruth's blessing and Lydia's small hand tucked in hers, she drove back toward the heart of North Carolina, back to the farmhouse her grandmother had left behind. The drive itself felt like a pilgrimage. Highways thinned into two-lane roads, then narrowed further into winding ribbons between fields. The landscape shifted, rows of pines, stretches of pasture where cattle grazed, old barns slumping into the earth. When she turned down the familiar gravel lane, her breath caught. The farmhouse stood as it always had, weathered siding peeling in strips, shutters askew, the porch sagging as though weary from decades of storms. Grass had grown wild around the steps, the garden lawn overtaken by weeds, yet the place pulsed with memory. Lydia skipped ahead, chasing a butterfly that rose from the tangle of clover. Evelyn walked slower, letting her hand trail along the worn railing. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice calling her in for supper, could almost see her father lifting her high against the twilight sky before his life was stolen. Here, time had not healed so much as preserved. The pain of those losses remained, but softened now, wrapped in the familiarity of wood and soil. She pushed open the door. Dust motes swirled in the beam of light, but the air smelled faintly of cedar and earth. Furniture stood where it had been abandoned years ago, a rocking chair in the corner, a quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed upstairs. The kitchen still held her grandmother's heavy cast-iron skillet, blackened from use. Evelyn touched it with reverence, remembering the biscuits she had once burned under Ruth's guidance, and for the first time in months she smiled. Outside, the old well waited at the edge of the yard, its wooden cover weathered but intact. Evelyn sat beside it while Lydia ran circles through the grass, her laughter ringing like wind chimes. She closed her eyes and felt the breeze against her face, heard the rustle of the wild garden, the creak of the porch. And in those sounds she felt Sam, not as a ghost, not as the dream figure who had pulled her from fire and urged her to live, but as a presence woven into the fabric of her life. He was in the courage that had brought her back here, in the strength that steadied her hands, in the resilience she now passed on to their daughter. The days fell into a gentle rhythm. Evelyn rose with the sun, brewed coffee in her grandmother's old percolator, and watched Lydia chase chickens from the neighboring farm. She mended what she could, replacing a shutter, clearing weeds from the garden, planting herbs where wild vines had once strangled the soil. Each task was small, but together they stitched a sense of purpose into her grief. At night, she sat on the porch with Ruth, who visited often and listened to cicadas sing. They spoke of Sam, not just the tragedy of his end, but the beauty of his life, his stubbornness, his humor, the way he had read Lydia to sleep with voices for every character. Remembering hurt, but it also healed. Evelyn realized she didn't have to erase her pain to move forward. She only had to carry it differently, not as a weight crushing her, but as a reminder of what had been worth loving. The farmhouse became more than shelter, it became sanctuary. Evelyn began teaching small cooking classes again, this time in her own kitchen. Neighbors came with baskets of tomatoes and jars of honey, curious to learn the recipes she had once mastered under the harsh lights of fine dining. Here, there was no shouting chef, no clock ticking down the seconds of service, only laughter, flour dusted across the counters, and the warmth of community. Lydia thrived, her childhood unfolding among fields and fireflies, much like Evelyn's had once done. Watching her daughter run barefoot through the grass, Evelyn saw the cycle of generations, the thread that tied past to present. Loss remained, but life continued, weaving joy alongside sorrow. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Evelyn sat on the porch steps, Lydia curled against her side. She looked out at the garden, at the well, at the house that had withstood storms and silence. For the first time, she felt not haunted but whole. Her life had not ended in a blaze, though it could have. It had not broken completely, though it came close. Instead, it had bent and remade itself, scarred but still standing, much like the farmhouse around her. Evelyn knew the pain of losing Sam would never vanish, but she also knew love did not end with death. It lived on in memories, in resilience, in the quiet strength that carried her through each day. This was not the happy ending she once dreamed of, but it was something more enduring, healing, resilience, acceptance. And as night settled over the Carolina countryside, Evelyn whispered a promise to the stars overhead. One Sam would have understood. I will keep going. For her. For us. For the life you gave me to keep living.